McGoldrick. Welcome. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you today.
Me too.
Where are you? Where in the world are you? What time of day is it?
I'm in central New Jersey, halfway between New York and Philadelphia, and it's 9:45
In the morning.
in the morning, and we are in our 6th month of lockdown,
6 months.
and New Jersey's getting worse this week for whatever reasons. So people are feeling more uh, intimidated rather than less so.
Have you been at home all this time?
Yeah, basically.
Mm. And are you zoomed out? Are you doing a lot of online living?
A lot of online living, and actually, I kind of like it in some ways. Um, it's a little bit more flexible, even a lot more flexible, because people don't have to travel to see you, and you can touch base with them for 5 or 10 minutes here or there if they're really stuck on an issue, that you can touch base with them more often than usual, which is sometimes useful. And I kind of like it in certain ways. Also, you see people at home, such as seeing you and your dog, which
Yeah.
usually I wouldn't get to see. So I get to see the pictures on the wall and the occasional adolescent who runs in and out, so forth. So that's, years ago we used to do home visits, but not for many years.
I wonder how this will impact on the future of therapy, family therapy, individual therapy, couple therapy, because it's not just that we're seeing inside other people's homes. People are seeing us in a different way as therapists. People
Yeah,
have their own kids running in the room and dinners burning and yeah, all
that's
kinds of
true.
things going on.
Yeah.
Do you
No,
think what do you think could be some of the fallout for therapists of this kind of um, mutual working from home visions of each other?
well, I hadn't thought about so much the issue of their seeing us, but there's definitely more flexibility when you're looking at people in their own situation, that where to talk somebody into bringing their mother or their, you know, spouse even, or a kid to a session, and then you have to cope with them for the whole session. This way you can spend 10 minutes with a kid or just meet the mother briefly, and it's not as intimidating, I think,
Yeah,
for the
yeah.
person as it might be to have to come to a session with,
I
a
have
strange therapist.
I have some colleagues in Ireland, one of whom carries your name, Monica White, and her colleagues. They've found that during the pandemic, more fathers have been available to come to sessions. They've kept their clinic open, actually, and maybe because people have been furloughed, laid off work, or
Yeah,
because for some other reason. They,
yeah,
but so parents who would otherwise not been able to come to family therapy sessions have been more able to. So that's been an interesting offshoot of some things. But I'm
yeah,
sure you're right. We're getting used to putting our heads around the corner when somebody else is online saying, when somebody says, come and say hello to the therapist or whatever.
yeah.
Hello. So things are changing. But can we jump? Can we jump back in time, if you like? I know people will be familiar with, or should be, some of your major texts, particularly your work on family genograms.
Mhm.
But I guess they'll also be interested then in some of the stories behind the writer, behind the family therapist who put this important work together in books and in teaching. So tell me a little bit about the era you were born into, the culture. What was happening in the world and in your community around the time you were born?
Okay, so I was born in 1943. It was during the war, but my family was not involved in the war. I was born in Brooklyn, New York. Um, I am fourth generation in the US. My great grandparents migrated, more or less all of them from Ireland. And my parents married sort of late. My father quite late. He was 39 when he married. And I have two sisters. I'm the middle of three. And when I was 6, we moved to a farm in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which is where my memories sort of start. And we grew up in this fabulous farm until I was a teenager, and then we moved back to Brooklyn, which is a good place to be if you're a teenager because you don't need a car to get around. So it was like I had the best in certain ways of both worlds.
So you were a real town and city, a sort of city and country girl then.
Yes.
How did you? Oh, well, there's several things I could ask, but how did you adjust to the countryside age 6? Was it a big playground?
Absolutely. We went out in the morning and nobody paid any attention to us, and we came in only at the last minute when it was getting so dark we couldn't see. That was it.
I'm interested to know a bit more about that. But I just want to jump back because when I picture Brooklyn, and I visit Brooklyn every few years, I have some friends there, and obviously Brooklyn is a very big, would you say borough?
Borough, yes, yes.
And so there are many parts of Brooklyn, and it's a very moving place. Lots going on.
Now. It's different now. Now it's very, very international.
Very. So what was it? I mean, but in a sense, you were part of the beginnings of international, I guess, when your family moved to Brooklyn, because.
Well, yeah, back in the 1850s.
Oh, okay.
When my father's grandfather came from Ireland, they were in a very Irish kind of enclave.
Was this family history passed down to you like orally through storytelling?
Okay.
Or did you have to dig into some of it? How did you learn more about your family history then? Or how did you hear about it from the get-go?
Well, that's a whole story. So in school, I became interested in Russian because I was of the era of Sputnik and so forth. So I majored in Russian. I fell in love with Dostoevsky. I got a master's degree in Russian studies. And then I couldn't find a way forward because it was all very political. And I was really just interested in whatever I thought was promoting cultural understanding or something or other. And so it was at that point, which happened to be the real start of the mental health movement in the US, I switched overnight into mental health. And first I thought I would become a psychologist, and then I decided social work was easier to get into and much more relevant clinically because the social workers seemed to be paying attention to the system, which made sense to me. And as I got into family therapy and social work as just the avenue to get into family therapy, there came a moment in 1972. I was 29, and I already had gotten my social work degree, and I was kind of on my way. And I heard Mary Bowen give a talk. I'd also had a fair amount of therapy along the way, mostly analyzing what was wrong with my mother. It seemed to be my problem.
Did it help? Did it help you?
The therapy?
Yeah. Working out
Well,
what was wrong with your mother, did that help you?
not really.
What sort of therapy do you think you should have had that would have been helpful?
No, actually, I had one useless therapist, and then I had one terrifically nice guy, Jungian therapist. Thank goodness I didn't see a Freudian, who, he was just like a good person. But really, that wasn't relevant to where I was going to go with that. Because what I was going to say is, I heard Mary Bowen give a talk in 1972, and that like flipped everything. I was already a dyed-in-the-wool family therapist for sure, and I never missed any chance to see or hear Virginia Satir or Jay Haley or whoever. And I heard Murray give a talk, and he was talking about however much therapy you might have had, or however much understanding you think you've gotten about your mother, if you can't sit in a room with her and feel fine, you're not there. And I thought, this guy is a serious idiot, and he never met my mother, and he has no idea what he's talking about. And that was the beginning of a whole transformation of...
That's so fascinating. So what was the nature of the transformation for you?
That I began coaching with one of Bowen's students, Phil Guerin. I began working with this new institute they were just forming at that time, and I had just moved to the medical school down here in New Jersey, and so I commuted up to Westchester every week, and I pretty much became a Bowenite, what I would call a Bowenite, and began to learn about thinking of my mother in a different way, rather than, what's her diagnosis, paying attention to what do I do that makes this not work, and how do I better understand her so that I change my behavior, since I can't really change her. And that just became a life journey. And then that led to culture, because once I got past my parents to my grandparents, who I didn't see as interesting people, then once I got past my grandparents, it was like, where did they come from? Ireland. And it was like, I knew nothing about Ireland. I never gave it a single thought, and nobody ever mentioned it to me. Where I grew up, I don't think there were many Irish people, if any. I'd have to think, what were people's names? They were white people. For sure, I grew up white, but Irish, even in Brooklyn, which was a very Irish city in many ways, where we lived was more classy than Irish.
So Irish people were associated with poorer housing, struggles to get work, anyway, lower income challenges. But somehow in your family,
it wasn't even a category, so I wouldn't even say I had a concept of what Irish was.
But you were sort of indicating that maybe you were in some kind of better housing, or a better location or something, than other Irish people.
I was in a very, what was probably a very waspy area of Brooklyn, Park Slope. And then when we moved back to the city, we went to Brooklyn Heights, which now it would be $1 million a year. You
Sure.
know, you couldn't live there. You couldn't
Yeah.
afford it.
So
So, but in those days, they were communities, and they just were not identifiably Irish in any way. That nobody ever noticed that I was Irish either. I didn't notice, and neither did anyone else. Nobody ever mentioned that to me.
do you think you had an Irish accent, or your parents had, or
Oh
was it
no,
more that?
no, no, no. My great grandparents must
Yeah,
have.
exactly. I just wondered if some kind of ways of talking, maybe also, maybe not accent, but ways of talking. Do you think there was something that you grew up
Well,
with?
funny you mention that. I found a video of my mother the other day when shortly before she died, 1991, in which she is correcting my grammar. And she had heard me give I guess she heard me give a talk maybe the day before. And so she's just giving me helpful feedback. So I was discussing it with this friend of mine, my very close friend, Nidia Garcia Prado, who's Puerto Rican. And she was saying, well, why, sort of, what was the deal? Why was she making those points? And I said, it's like my mother was always trying to be classy, whatever classy was, she was trying to be it. And so we used to kind of make fun of her pretensions. And there she was when I was like 50 and she was, almost 80, saying that I should pronounce two more specifically and more
So this is
clearly.
a story of the Irish in relation to the English, because
Oh,
English
yes,
is the first
definitely.
language of the
Yeah,
Irish. Well, it isn't any. It wasn't.
yeah.
It became enforced, and so Irish people then had to speak English well, and then as immigrants in a predominantly English-speaking country of America and New York, or Brooklyn, let's say, you were still being encouraged by this kind of cultural imperative to have your ways of talking recolonized again into. Do you, do you think that do you think your family had bought into the notion? Were they proud of their Irish roots, or were they discarding of them?
They were discarding of them. I mean, nobody. I had an aunt Mamie who I adored, and she used to try to talk about things Irish. Um, but she was just like the poor aunt who was the caretaker of the grandchildren and so forth. She never married, and she was taking care of everybody basically. But my mother, most of all, was probably it was a gender thing as well, trying to prove herself and trying to be good enough. They both of my parents went to the best Ivy League schools, and so did my sisters and I. But for me, I realized only later that I didn't get it, that there were rules and that I didn't really know the rules because nobody really mentioned it. My mother would tell me how to dress and how to speak, but she never exactly conveyed why that, sort of what was the deal? What was the club you were trying to become part of? So I had no idea what I was
So
doing.
you understood that there were rules, but you didn't understand the context for them. Is that correct?
No, I can't even say I understood that there were rules. I just felt most of the time mystified.
How much do you think that goes on still in, I know America's a big place, the United States, um, of people feeling, on the one hand, the United States has a reputation of being proud of the fact it was built by uh, uh, immigrants of from different parts of the world, and on the other hand, encouraging through that a sort of nationalistic identity of we're proud to be Americans, particularly because of all the different places we come from. But how much do you think that continues? And how much do you think people maybe try and hide where they've come from, a bit like some of the early immigrants might have done?
Definitely, definitely. And I think basically my parents were trying to pass for the dominant group, and that was the deal. And the segregation of people of color from white people was total. I never went to school with more or less anyone who was of color. I was raised by someone. The closest relationship I had was a caretaker whose ancestors were slaves. So I experienced it up close and personal, but it was never discussed. Not at all. And her life was about making our life more visible.
So a classic family therapy question is, tell me more about the father. I haven't heard much about your dad in this. What did he do? What was his part in your upbringing, as much as you want to say?
I adored my father. My father was a sweetheart. And he loved all of us, but I was his favorite. I think because I had red hair and he had red hair. And I guess I looked like him. Truthfully, I think if my parents could have had the opposite gender roles, if he could have been the home care father and she could have been the business person, they would have been fine. But my mother was stuck doing the home care thing. She couldn't cook. She burned everything. She just found it all boring. And she was a great businesswoman. She was like very outgoing and wasn't able to have a job because that would have made him look like he couldn't support the family or something. And my father was brilliant and at one level successful. He was New York City controller for in a very wonderful reform era where he basically in some ways got screwed, but he was a controller of New York for the longest period of anyone in history.
I don't understand what the term controller means. What sort of...
Oh, it's the person who controls the money. Well, supposedly controls the money. It's the money man. It's right after the mayor.
Oh.
Is the controller. It's the money guy, like the accountant for New York City, which is a very big job.
Wow. That's a big responsibility. Did he work long hours?
Well, basically, when we lived on the farm, it was a farm he had bought before he met my mother. And she never even thought about a farm, never mind saw a farm. And she got stuck on the farm and he lived in the city. And he came home on weekends.
Ah, so it was
and three. My mother and Margaret, the one who raised us, were like the parents in residence, and my father was the visiting dignitary, as I think about it.
And remind me who Margaret was in the
Margaret came from North Carolina. She was African heritage, and she was hired the week I was born. So I was extremely close to her. And she basically lived with us and went home to her husband for 4 days every 2 weeks.
Did she have children?
No, unfortunately, she had twin sons that died, and she never had any other children. We knew her with her second husband. We didn't know her first husband.
How long was she with your family or with you?
Until she died, which is after I left for college. So from the week I was born until the year after I left for college. She died, 1961.
So you had two mums, or is that not the right way of putting it?
I did. I experienced it. Well, let me put it this way. When I was in high school, I wrote a paper about Margaret for one of my senior papers called A Better Than Real Mother. How about that? My mother wasn't probably too enthusiastic because my English teacher, when my family came to my graduation, my English teacher reached her hand out to Margaret of like, oh, I'm so happy to meet you. I know who you are. And my mother just standing there,
Wow.
That must have been hard.
Mm. And so what kind of teenager were you? By now you're back in Brooklyn, I guess.
Yes, when I was kind of 10th grade, I moved back. I was there for 3 years, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. That's the last 3 years of high school. I graduated a little bit early. So my mother would say I was really horrible. I'm sure that I disliked her and I disapproved of her, and I wasn't outspoken, but I would just like give her a withering look as she gave me lots of withering looks too. And I always was afraid of having a daughter who might do to me what I did to her. So I didn't have a daughter. I have just one son. But I had a very serious boyfriend starting in 11th grade, so 2 years of high school, and that became like the son that my family never had. So he kind of was embraced by the family, and he's still involved with our family. And he became a lawyer. My father was a lawyer. He was, political. My father was political. So
Okay.
I think I got lots of extra credit for having a boyfriend that they all liked, so that I could hide out to some extent.
So at some point, presumably, you and he separated, and
yeah, when I went to college.
And was the family okay with that? With you?
Oh no, I don't know my parents. I think they just, but my Aunt Mamie, the one Irish relative, she used to say, "Oh, whatever happened to Jimmy? I always thought that would be a great thing in the spring if it didn't spring off." It's like, oh, Mame, it did spring off. Sorry about that,
So how did you leave home?
I just went to college, which was in a different city. My sisters went to the same school. It was 4 hours away.
So you went to that college because your older sister had been there, or how was it all decided where you would go?
No. The idea was you were supposed to go to the best school you could get into and then marry Prince Charming. That was the deal. And all of us were Radcliffe rejects. So we got into what was called Pembroke. It was Brown University, which probably our whole class was full of Radcliffe rejects. Now Brown is a very hot school, but in those days, that was the thing. And it was still the Ivy League, so you were still supposed to
did you feel
obey the rules that I didn't understand. I mean, it took me many years to get it was a cultural thing and a gender thing and a social class thing.
So how did you learn to see these rules? How did they make themselves visible to you?
They didn't, and I was just always mystified. Then it was even worse. Then I went to Yale after that because I didn't find the Prince Charming husband I was supposed to find at Brown. So I was like, okay, so then you have to go on to more schooling because you still have to find the guy, right? So I went to Yale that had a 14-to-1 ratio of men to women. I thought, oh, that's like a good deal because I'm sure I'll find
Were
someone.
were you interested in men?
Oh yeah. No, I had actually been in love with somebody during college who sadly died in a car accident my senior year.
Oh God.
So that was very traumatic.
Wow.
Yeah.
Who knew about that love that you had? Did your family know?
Well, they did, but they didn't really take it very seriously. They didn't really know him very well. He dropped out of school after the first year. He did visit our family a time or two. Um, he came with a friend, so maybe that looked like it wasn't as serious as I felt it was. But it was very, very traumatic. But my mother was like very surprised that I was so depressed after he died.
Who,
Uh,
who helped you through that time?
well, his best friend was wonderful. He was fabulous, actually. Uh, and we were both done in by it. And uh, and then I would have to say, well, of course, my friends. I had a friend from high school who she had also a traumatic experience, kind of around the same years. She's still my friend, and I shared a lot with her, and other friends from high school, more friends from high school, and then. It took me 2 years to actually go to the grave, and his mother was fabulous. She has, I mean, she's dead now, but she had no idea of how meaningful it was, the way she dealt with me. It was extremely.
It's a very traumatic thing to happen to somebody so young. Well, to happen to anybody, but it's a really, I'm assuming it must have been quite a formative thing for you, a sort of a bit
Yeah,
of a
very
before and
much so.
after.
Yeah, sure,
Mm.
definitely, definitely.
What were you studying and what did you go on to study?
Russian and Russian.
Ah,
And it was in Connecticut. After I got my master's in Russian studies, that I then switched into family therapy.
so tell us a bit about that switch then. I mean, not everybody can say they were studying Russian at master's level and at undergraduate level and then decided to go into family therapy. That is quite a switch. So what's the
Well,
story?
okay, so I was getting my master's. It was the end of the year, and this guy picked me up in a local diner, and he was studying psychology. And I thought, that's it. That's it. There's something you could study and you'd have something to do afterwards that would be really interesting. And so overnight, I basically came home and told my parents. My mother was fantastic about it. She was like, whatever you want to do. And it was like they were definitely running out of money by that point, my parents. And so that was not good news. And when I said social work, that was like worse news because that was like lower class on top of psychology. My mother was always quite suspicious of psychologists.
What do
They
you
can.
think the suspicion was about?
Oh, she was afraid somebody was going to analyze her and find her, you know,
Okay.
disturbed, which is what I was always doing. She was
Oh,
right about me.
so from Russian to psychology to social work and family therapy. Say more about that
It
transition.
was I was at when you say like what era were you born? It was perfect. 1966. It was the mental health center movement. The barriers were down. The communities were opening. It was like, what can we do to help people? People were leaving mental hospitals, having community psychology, and I was in on the ground floor. I was one of the first people hired at the local mental health center. I worked there for a year before going into social work. And that was where I really decided that social work was the thing.
So what was the ethos during that era then, with the deconstruction of the mental health hospitals and opening of community health resources and increase
It was terrific, although the gender things and the racial things were still largely in place.
Yeah.
But it was the 60s, so even though we weren't really, and it was New Haven, so it was kind of a Yale thing, even though it was community mental health. So it was, all of that patriarchal stuff was still going, and the white social class thing was still going, but I had fantastic experiences, just fantastic. And just to give you one example that I still would say was the best. So my first year of social work school, well, I went to social work school only in the summer. So in the year, you were like working full time. And I was working at this Yale hospital that required anyone who came there, the family had to be seen once a week by the social worker. They had to come in one evening a week for a meeting without the identified patient to be seen in a group. And every Saturday morning, they had to be seen in a multifamily group with the identified patient. So they couldn't, your person couldn't come to the hospital unless you agreed that every Wednesday night and Saturday morning and one more time a week, you had to be involved as the family.
And what did you see in that model that moved?
It just made thinking systems so obvious, is that obviously when people are psychologically speaking in trouble, it pertains to the family. And that's the way to intervene. And I still think that, even though nobody does it now.
But do you think families felt blamed, or did they feel supported? What was the kind of feel in that moment in time?
I think they felt very supported because of the multifamily aspect. Because they had each other. And after your patient left the unit, you had to come for 4 more weeks. And that was for you to adapt, but also for you to, there was a very strong ethos of you learn and then you teach other families that they'll get through it and they'll see that you came through it.
So there was a notion of sharing the expertise, that people would be patients in the hospital, but they'd go back out and be community members with first-person experience.
And every psychiatrist, including the head guy, would participate in those multifamily groups. And every psychiatric aide, whatever your role was, you sat in those meetings.
And presumably at that point, your reference to issues to do with the kind of oppressions of the patriarchy and racism were still in place, in as much as men presumably were expected to step up into their head of family positions in order to help others get well, or get well themselves, and presumably they were primarily white families.
Yeah. Yes.
Mm. And so the 60s was a very powerful time in terms of people's politics across the world, but particularly in Europe and the States. I don't know about elsewhere. Where were you in amongst all of that? Were you a political person? Were you politicized? Were you participating? Or was it more of a backdrop while you focused on your work?
It was a backdrop and I was just trying to learn family therapy. I mean, once I left Russian, that's what I was trying. I mean, until then I was trying to get a grasp on Russian, and then I was trying to learn about families.
Okay. And so what happened then in your career? What happened next?
Well, then I met my husband in 1968, and he was studying there. He was in physics at the time, and so when he got his degree in 1972, I knew we would have to leave and go somewhere else. And by that time I was working, and I got involved with a psychiatrist. We were doing co-therapy, and he didn't get tenure, that guy. So then my husband and I and that guy all needed to go someplace together so I could keep working with the guy. And that's how I got the job at the medical school here, because they wanted him, and I was just a social worker. Who cares? So I was a. He said he wouldn't take the job unless they took me. It's like, whatever, we don't care.
The
He's a
very
social
different
worker.
days, very different employment
Very
practices,
different.
and
Oh, yeah.
great that that opportunity happened. How did you grow family therapy? How did you grow as a family therapist? What did you see that was needed that you stepped into?
Well, first of all, having that guy as a mentor in those days, he was a big bully, but he believed in what we were doing, and he believed that I was the one to do it because he had to play psychiatrist. So he had other jobs, but nobody cared what I did. So I was able to start supervising other people in family therapy and developing training. I became eventually the head of the family training program at the medical school and the mental health center there. And I could pretty much do what I want because I was a social worker. They didn't care about social work. I was a woman. They didn't care about women. And so I was free. And I had the prestige of it being a medical school.
What an
And
extraordinary. Go on.
once I met Murray Bowen and the people who had trained with him, Phil Guerin, and they were starting this institute in Westchester, that became my sort of spiritual home. I got connected to Betty Carter, who was an extremely important mentor and friend for the rest of our lives. I mean, as long as she lived. And
what an extraordinary collection of possibilities and coincidences that merged there. And it's a good example, I think, sometimes about how being not noticed allows for all kinds of good developments that are sort of subversive developments, really.
Yep.
That you have to get them through under the radar.
Yep.
So at that point, I'm imagining there was some family therapy training starting to come online.
Yes,
So,
there were.
did you copy somebody else's? Did you model the training you were involved in setting up on somebody else's, or were you inventing?
Well, I became a follower of Murray Bowen, so I did that. Those became the core ideas that I was using, and I was teaching at that place as well as at the medical school.
So which ideas did you keep, and how do you think you built on his work? How do you think you and I think this is always a difficult question, how we develop, maybe critique the work of people we've admired. How do you think that came across in your practice and the trainings you set up?
So basically, I would say that I believe everything I do is a fit with Murray Bowen's ideas. Now, he wouldn't say that. He thought as soon as I got interested in culture that I had sort of fallen off the edge. As soon as I began to talk about it, he thought that was trivial. He wasn't keen on the life cycle stuff that Betty and I started doing by the late 70s. And he was definitely not excited about the gender stuff. But I think all of that is a complete fit with his ideas. It's just that, he was this Southern waspy guy and a psychiatrist of a certain era. And he didn't, couldn't, like the rest of us, see beyond his blinders. But I do think it's a very important fit with all of his ideas even today.
So what would you say some of the gifts are that you brought to family therapy?
Well, I was late to understand about gender, for sure. And I think a lot of that had to do with my having come from this Ivy League-ish background, always trying to like move up class wise, that makes you have to be like a man. So I kind of missed, and New Haven was, in terms of my experience there, like conservative. So I think that was a really negative experience. But the good thing, maybe it had to do with having grown up with sisters, and my mother grew up with sisters. So maybe there was a long history of that, that I always had women friends. And um, that became very important at the medical school. The fact that I had Betty Carter in that other institute, major, major. And then I developed a cadre of people within the medical school, women eventually in the 80s, by the 80s, that we began to speak with each other about issues of, you know, like when you don't get promoted or you don't get an opportunity or something, you think it's about you, unless you have a cuddle group who says, you know what, that's not about you. You're actually terrific and fine, and you'd be the person. Uh, so we began talking to each other. Now, before that, I did have men who were mentors, which then my father was certainly a mentor, emotionally a mentor.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it meant that I sought men who were like this guy I went to, who got me the job basically at the medical school. He was he talked the chairman into making me the head of family therapy. And because he stormed into I couldn't have done it myself. He stormed into the room and said, there's, you know, you just hired a child psychiatrist who's a real asshole, and he can't do it, and you had already the person who could do it, and it's Monica, and she's the only one who can do it, and what is wrong with you? And so the guy then said, okay, you can have it, but if I ever find, he actually said this, if I ever find a man or a psychiatrist more qualified than you, you'll have to move over. And I was like, oh, thank you.
So at what point did the gender awakening happen for you? When did
Not
you
till the
start?
80s. Not till the 80s.
And what triggered it, Monica?
I guess it was in the air, and in family therapy, you know, like the Betty Carter and Olga Silverstein and Peggy Papp and Marianne Walters. Well, Betty, Peggy, and Olga had been late retread students together, so they had become friends, and they got into it, and then I guess it being in the air, you know, they and other people probably got me thinking about it. And
Family,
once you start seeing it, then you see it.
family therapy was quite late to the table in terms of analysing power around gender and race. Were there some other people in the field of family therapy earlier on that you recall who did talk about gender as an issue, power as an issue, race and culture, ethnicity as issues? And because I'm wondering how they were seen, whether they were backgrounded, whether they were seen as people who just had a chip on their shoulder, or, you know, one of those other stereotype characterizations.
Maybe there were people, but I probably just wasn't really noticing. I mean, I had a cadre of friends of color, not just friends of color, I mean, but it was sort of more mixed because it was community mental health. But in terms of people in the field who were leaders, really the structural model was the only one that was pretty pretty diverse. And I went for training with Harriet Ponte, probably by the late 70s. But I didn't have a very good experience with him, even though I did. I mean, I think he's brilliant. And I was coming from a Bowen perspective, and I was wanting to learn structural or use structural in some ways, but personality-wise, I couldn't do what he was trying to get me to do. So that never worked well. So I worked with him for some years, but didn't.
Do you mean he couldn't get you to share in an appreciation of certain theories or to conduct practice in a certain way?
Yeah. I a couple of times brought families, and he would try to get me to do things more aggressively than I was at all comfortable doing, or would still be comfortable doing. I mean, later on, we both came to a very positive feeling about each other. And I hired him. He lost his job there, and I hired him at the medical school. But he mostly worked with my colleagues more than with me, because I still did not like. He would always sort of say, what's your feeling? And I don't always know what my feeling is right at the moment, so I can't just say it like that. And I just would feel very on the spot and exposed and not good.
Mm. A while ago, I was asking you what you thought your gifts were to the field of family therapy, and somehow we segued into something else. Oh. What do you think? If you know?
Oh, I think you were talking about. I mean, I think I was trying to answer coming towards either gender or culture.
Okay.
And that's how I got into Harriet Ponte.
Yeah,
he was one of the earlier people who, at some level, influenced that. But no, I would really say I was late to gender and came when other people were beginning to come, influenced by the people who did become known and did speak out about gender. And
but what do you think? I mean, if we were to Google Monica McGoldrick family therapy, what would be the top hits, do you think, that will pop up in terms of themes from family therapy?
Well, I think both culture and gender would be up there.
Mm. So when you started to, sorry, say the
genograms and the life cycle and loss. I mean, those would be
okay.
And I mean, in 1984. Okay, so this is a story probably worth telling, because this also has to do with the way gender played out problematically. No, in 1981 or 2, I had, this is a little bit of a shaggy dog story, but I guess it's relevant. I better put it in here. So I wrote a paper on Irish families once I began to get about culture. That was in the 70s, from 1972 on, I was getting interested in culture and realizing I was Irish. 1975, I went to Ireland and the world changed. I became completely stupefied that everything had to do with culture. And what the hell was I thinking that I didn't realize that before then? Everything changed. It's like, I thought my mother, she had all these diagnoses, and it was like, oh my God, she's just Irish. They all do. They are all like that. Other mothers do the same thing. And, waiting till you have company and embarrassing your kid in front of the other person. It's like, I thought it was just my mother. But it wasn't. It was very common, of teasing and ridicule and stuff. And I just talked to everyone about it. I began writing about it. We had conferences about it. We invited therapists of different backgrounds. And I just never stopped asking everybody, so what's your story, and where are your family from, and what kind of values did they have, and
So you
So
became
when I came,
Irish.
I
You,
be, well,
sorry.
I didn't become Irish. I realized I had always been Irish. I just didn't know.
Yeah.
I was always trying to become Jewish, actually,
Why is
which was
that?
easy. And what?
Why is that?
Oh, because first of all, the field was very Jewish. It was very white, but very Jewish. And Jews talk about all kinds of things that they didn't talk about in my family. It's like they say it out loud, and it's like, whoa, this is fantastic. So I was always trying to be a little bit Jewish. But after 1975, I just wanted to understand all the differences. So I wrote a paper with this guy, John Pierce, about the Irish. And Family Process was going to publish it, and they told me that they were going to have this person, Nolig Byrne, write a response. Like, well, whatever. And so she wrote a response, and she didn't like the paper very much, it seemed like. And then they said I had to respond to what she said. And that's like, she's some, I don't know, nun or something. She's a very, but whatever it is, she's not saying it very directly, but she clearly doesn't like whatever I said. I don't want to respond to it. And Don Block, who was the editor, he forced me to. So I had to get a lot of help to write this thing. And I was always fantasizing about Noli, of like, what kind of weird person was she and what was she really trying to say? And then I had occasion, because once I went to Ireland, then I wanted to go all the time. Every year I went. And so I was going with Lynn Hoffman in 1981. We were going to travel around Ireland. She was there to do some kind of a conference or something. And she said, oh, I want you to meet my friend Nolig. You're going to love her. And Imelda, oh, you're going to love both of them. They're just so fabulous. And as soon as she said Nolig, I said, oh, no, listen, why don't I just meet you after you're finished? Because as much as I was interested, it's like, I don't think I'm ready for that conversation. So she wouldn't take no for an answer. So I met her and fell in love with Nolig and Imelda. And my world changed again in terms of, all the things that brought me. But during that trip with Lynn, she was a person very self-preoccupied, but I was asking her about her story, and I thought she was just amazingly smart and amazing things she had done, and she had influenced so many. She'd written Satir's book, Conjoint Family Therapy, and she had told Mnuchin, she'd given him the word structural, which she thought that what he was saying was structural, but he didn't have she gave a concept. She helped Jay Haley put together a lot of important things, and it was like, whoa. And then there were all kinds of other people, and the Milan people were coming along and so forth. And I thought, wow, there are terrific women in the field. We should have a meeting of women family therapists. So I came home and I spoke to Betty. They had already started the Women's Project. And I said, listen, we got to do a conference of women family therapists. I traveled with Lynn, and, this would be terrific, and women never get together, and it would be so good. And she was a little hesitant and said, well, I'll have to run it past the other women in the women's group. And I said, sure, whatever. That would be just terrific. However we do it, like the more the merrier. And if your whole group does it, they're all famous and more people will come. So she had me present the idea to the women, and they turned me down and said no, they were not interested. They didn't think there were, this is shameful. They did not think there were women out there that they wanted to spend time with.
Wow.
One of them in particular. but the others voted with her. So I didn't think that much about it because they were trying to get me to basically write a book for them, and I felt like it was like I was supposed to be the secretary, so I wasn't really liking that so much anyway, because I was writing my own books, you know. Anyway, I went home and I called Froma Walsh and Carol Anderson and said, hey, you know, I got this idea. I talked to Lynn Hoffman. And I was thinking we should have a women's conference, women family therapists. You want to do it? And they were like, wow, that sounds great. Yeah, let's do it. And I said, I spoke to the Women's Project, but they didn't want to do it. But, you know, we had already done a number of conferences. I was used to doing conferences. So we did it. And 1984, we had a big conference of senior women family therapists and some emerging ones. It was mostly white, not too many people of color. And we did it again in 1986, but I didn't want it to become a club, so we just did two. But it had a very powerful impact on all of us. And
in what ways?
I don't think ever, the women who we talked with there, I don't think ever felt so isolated again at national conferences, because it was like we had talked alone together and we knew that women's voices were important. And it just made us all feel less alone.
Besides decreasing the sense of isolation, was there anything else that came out of that about, for example, how to think about family therapy in a differently gendered way, or how to?
Well, there were lots. I mean, the presentations were a lot about paying attention to gender and child rearing and work and money. Ellen Berman, who's a psychiatrist in Philadelphia, did a presentation now. I forget what she called it, but basically the idea was, considering money, that we would all feel so grateful if anybody invited us to do a workshop that, you know, you're going to pay me 5 cents. Oh, wow, that would be terrific, you know, and well, no, we're not going to pay your expenses. That's all right, I'll, you know. Whereas, you know, men would be charging $3,000 a day and all their expenses. And Ellen did this presentation about you should always sleep on an invitation and then speak to a friend before you call the people back, just to be sure you got a fair deal going, which was like a shock to so many of us. But it became part of our realizing that we had to do a rethink and not just feel so lucky to be included, or, you know, like if the favorite guy paid special attention to us, then we were special, rather than, as I remember Kitty LePerriere saying at one of the meetings, you know, it was a Saturday night, and she said, this is unbelievable. All my life, I was always thinking on Saturday night, if you didn't have a date, then you had a problem. And there is no place I would rather be than right here with all these amazing women.
It's fascinating, and it's interesting to think about those worries about single group conferences. You know, it could be women only, queer only, Black or Hispanic only. And people are very threatened by those gigs.
Yes.
And they don't want them to become clubs because they gather power. There'd be more of a voice. And yet, I guess, one of the challenges for our profession and for society is how do we take those ideas back out into society, the experience, the enhanced confidence, the new knowledges, without those things disappearing. I mean, and being repressed again, being lost, meaning not accidentally lost, but forced into obscurity. Do you think there's room still for women-only conferences in family therapy, and maybe for Black family therapists to meet in family therapy and so on?
Well, I think there's a need for, I don't know whether meetings in family therapy, I'm not sure how the best way to move things forward, but I definitely think that women need to talk to other women, and people of color need to talk to other people of color, because there's certain things white people are just so dumb. We just don't get it, that if they keep trying to talk to us, they're going to feel invalidated all the while, you know? So I don't know that having conferences separately, but I certainly think having close connections, ongoing connections, is extremely important, especially for people of color, and for women, and for anybody LGBTQ. I mean, the whole thing is expanding in ways that you have to be able to collaborate with other people who share your experiences in order to help undo the invalidation that anybody who's at the margins experiences, you know? So.
This is a sort of segue into the talk about genograms, really, your work about genograms. And I was thinking, you know, one of the things that fascinates me about genograms is how many absent stories, absent characteristics, absent people there are in the work about genograms, and what stories lie behind them. And quite a common story, I'm sure, is that one day my mum showed me a family tree she'd created, and she was very pleased with herself that she'd gone to a lot of trouble to create a family tree. And she put in my brother and his wife, and put in and he'd only been married maybe a year or so. I don't think they had any children at that time. And she put in my cousin and her husband. Maybe they had children at the time, I can't remember. And she put in me. And I said, where's my partner of 20 years, a lesbian, a woman partner? And she said, but you aren't going to have children.
Whoa.
So, and there was my partner, Gwyn, who would be doing everything for my mum, shopping, looking after, thinking about her, prompting me to do things. And somehow it was the biological story. And in some ways, in a Jewish context, my family's Jewish, I can kind of understand the importance of perpetuating the community, the Jewish people, after she was a Holocaust survivor. So children would have been particularly important. But nevertheless, it was a very scientific first order way of describing. Now I'm wondering, I suppose, how many other people, and I've always been curious, how many other people, children, go missing from genograms. And in some ways, genograms are narratives. And we could say, well, it's a social construction, and it might be your story, your family's story, and does the truth matter? And in other ways, we can say, well, from a first order factual point of view, unless we know the real who's who, then some people are oppressed by being excluded. So I'm just sort of wondering what sort of stories you've come across that prompted you to develop your ways of promoting genograms as a very important method of inquiry in family therapy.
Well, first of all, I don't think it's all biological.
Of course not.
And that comes from my own experience, that who raised me, Margaret, as well as my parents, as well as my Aunt Mamie, who raised 5 generations of our family. She had no children of her own. Margaret's children didn't survive. But I am one of Margaret's and Aunt Mamie's children. And if you didn't know what they were to me and you didn't have their names, you would not be able to help me out if I was really struggling. I mean, it would be good if you mentioned my parents and my sisters and my son and my grandson, blah. But it wouldn't be enough, because that really matters. Not to mention that there's just a whole lot that we are learning, including I myself, about secrets that the DNA hides, that people who are not the children of who they thought they were. I'm not a McGoldrick, it turns out.
What do you mean?
I spent 43 years studying my McGoldrick roots. My great-grandfather came to Brooklyn from Donegal, worked with cousins. They were all McGoldricks. They were in the liquor business, blah, blah, blah. According to the DNA, I'm not related to them.
What does that mean?
That means that somehow there were secrets kept.
But I'm asking, does that mean you don't have Irish DNA, or?
Oh no, I'm all Irish except for a very teensy bit West Asian.
Okay.
Whatever that means, but I'm like 99.1% Irish. So it happened in Donegal, whatever happened, but it just wasn't McGoldrick genes that came into me. But it doesn't mean at an emotional level that I'm not a McGoldrick. And it also doesn't mean that other connections that were not biological are not a part of who I am, including the experiences and stories of the people who formed the people who did form me. So I am very keen for paying attention to all the teachers, the mentors, the, you know, religious people, if there were such people, and the aunts and uncles and cousins and other relationships, and paying attention to the relationship, not just the technical, you know. Yes, you do want to know how many brothers were there and how many sisters and whatever, but you got to find out about the rest of it too. And it has to be inclusive.
When you were doing research for your book on family trees and genograms, what you looked into quite a number of well-known families. Were there some things that you discovered that really took you by surprise?
Actually, it was, I came to that work differently from that. I was not interested in, I saw genograms as a basic map, but I was interested in which I've never succeeded with, I was interested in computerizing genograms so that they would become a part of our healthcare records. And that you wouldn't have to keep asking the same questions over and over, that your record would be there and it would just get corrected. And to do that, you needed to standardize how you did a genogram. So that's where I came in, is that I was wanting to find out how you could computerize it and keep track of who you belong to and all issues of functioning and so forth in a record, in a map. So genograms became the map that I was trying to create. And so the standardization, you just had to do it. So I got involved in that.
I can understand the need for a better piece of software, and it may exist now, I don't know. But the idea of standardize, I don't think it particularly exists in my circles anyway, because I still see a lot of case studies and papers by family therapy students who've, they've been spending hours in a Word document trying to match up lines and circles and squares and all the rest of it. But there's something about standardizing depiction of family that sounds a contradiction with what you're talking about, that there needs to be room for people to show clusters of people, significant others, in ways that isn't just about, for example, biological ties and so on.
Well, I started out with the wish to standardize genograms. I have to say that I did want to do that. And part of the reason I did was that I wanted to, and this comes from a Bowen perspective, there's often I would say, a great overfocus on things like diagnoses, which I think are particularly troublesome and problematic and developed by a bunch of white guys that often mean virtually nothing. But level of functioning, level of education, level of, disability, whatever. I think all those things do affect us, not just our own health, but but that of the other people in our families. So I was interested, in order to computerize it, which I wanted to do, that I didn't, it just seemed so cumbersome that you would have to like redo your genogram every time you found out that, your mother had another brother that you never heard about before, but he's there and he doesn't fit because you don't have any room for him, or maybe he had 5 children they forgot to tell you about or something. I couldn't see how you could keep track of things without being able to modify them. So that was my goal. And I was thinking about, let's say, in my case, Margaret, who would be on my genogram, and her husband and her previous husband and her children. And I don't know her extended family, which is all part of how racism has operated. I've made great efforts actually to find out, and I think I have found a few people, but I can't get them to respond to me. Now I got this information just before the whole COVID thing. I can understand if they're like, why would we want to relate to that person?
Maybe. Hard to know. There are so many reasons.
But I'm thinking there are, it's complicated, and it's all complicated. So yes, there are things we can't keep track of, and things that we should keep track of that are more complicated than our, whoever might be on our genogram, even the emotional genogram, because you can't have all the teachers and all the, other friends of your childhood and so forth. You have to be able to bring certain things forward, like about illness and patterns of dysfunction and functioning. And
I guess it depends what the purpose of doing a genogram is. If it's to create a sort of an accurate description, a sort of first order picture of who's who, that's one thing. But a lot of people now, of course, using genograms as therapeutic tools, as both to sort of mark out who the players are in the script, and also to think about them as more fluid, where people and places and so on get moved around, so they become less of a fixed picture and more a work in progress, perhaps, where people maybe also feel a bit more invited to be in control of the narrative or understand some of the hidden narratives.
Well, one thing along those lines that we got involved with through our colleague Eliana Gill is doing family play genograms. So we use miniatures, and we have families create genograms, and they put all the friends and the other people, and they choose items to represent them, and they tell stories about, and also choose items to represent yourself at your worst, yourself at your best, yourself now, your mother at her worst, your mother at her best, and so forth. it's a fabulous exercise to use with families, and it helps them see themselves more broadly. So I'm very
Ah,
keen on those.
I'd like us to jump a little bit to thinking about the future of the profession, the family therapy field. And I'm wondering, what are you most excited about that's going on in the family therapy field? What do you want to continue? And maybe there's a counter question there of what are you worried we're at risk of losing?
Okay, well, I cannot tell you what I'm most excited about because I think we've gone in a very bad direction in the US. Very bad.
In what kind of way?
Big pharma, managed healthcare, pays no, it's totally non-systemic, totally non-systemic.
So you're saying more people who would have found their way to family therapy are now being directed towards a pharmaceutical treatment?
For sure. And psychiatry gets no training. I mean, there's no training in systemic thinking whatsoever in psychiatry. And even in psychology, it's like at the margins. And in social work, that should have owned family therapy because they started out the most systemic and also thinking of communities, which I think that's a whole other important topic that needs to be included in the conversation when you think about what goes wrong for people or what goes right for people is, do you have community support? Do you have schools that you can trust and that support your family? Do you have healthcare that supports your family? Do you have politicians who support your family and so forth? We've been going downhill for 40 years, since the 1980s.
Because of big
all these forces of big money, dark money, and people who are just thinking about themselves, about, how do I make more? How do I do better?
That could sound like the family therapy community or profession is impotent in some way, that it's not going to be able to make enough difference. But I'm sort of wondering if, I mean, I think we're halfway there in the UK, but I think there still is quite a strong family therapy profession. The problem here is that everybody's been employed by mainstream institutions, not everybody, a lot of people. And so people are fragmented into different workplaces. The profession is really about training and registration. It's not necessarily about community development of ideas. Even our journals have been sort of subsumed by a sort of research agenda of a certain sort. So I was sort of thinking, is there anything, if you were going to sort of be able to have the power to put a message out there to the family therapy community in the United States to take action, what would be the action you think would be needed?
I think systemic thinking is the key. I think it's the salvation for our planet. I think it's the salvation for the US. I think it's the salvation for Highland Park. I think it's the salvation for the organization of healthcare and education and everything else. I just think systemic thinking is absolutely the key. We'll deal with climate change if we think systemically. We'll deal with all of these issues, but
In a way,
powerful forces keeping us from thinking systemically.
Systemic therapists can also.
By the way,
sorry, go on, say some more.
I was just going to say there's no systemic idea I ever had that I feel like doesn't belong in the realm of what we're trying to think about. So it isn't that the ideas let us down. I don't think the ideas let us down at all.
Maybe we also somehow, if families came to us and said, we just don't feel there's anything we can do, we'd be trying to help them look at what we can do. And sometimes I think the systemic profession needs to think about what it can do to, in a sense, participate as a profession that thinks of itself as a form of activism and not just as a clinical set of activities. But I really agree with you in terms of systemic ideas being something that could be a massive intervention if only we thought about them beyond the consulting room.
Well, I think now I'm actually more optimistic than an awful lot of people around here in terms of our having that we are really at the nadir right now in the US. We're in a really bad situation. But I see, not in family therapy, but in the larger movements, which are systemic, I see a lot of reason to hope that we will rethink ourselves in terms of the politics, to becoming more systemic in how we think about things, about education, healthcare, and all of it. I feel like we might actually begin to deal with racism. I'm kind of hopeful.
So what would your advice? What would your advice be to the training institutes, or what would you be putting in place if, you know?
No, here's the thing. There are no training institutes here really anymore. Now you might not want to include this part. I'm just saying. But I mean, you can take it, but we don't have training in family therapy anymore. We don't train, and neither does anybody else. Everything has been taken over by the sort of managed care forces, and people have the least possible training. 2 years, it might not even all be systemic. It's like you have courses in this and that counseling, and you then go out and are expected to help people when you don't have the basic clue about how to think systemically, which is hard anyway, and then make interventions, which is really hard under the current cultural circumstances, political circumstances. And they're going to pay them $30,000 a year, which isn't enough to live on. And they don't encourage any kind of ongoing training. There's nothing. You just need the competence level, which they're charging more and more for, of X number of hours of certain kinds of approved courses, and it's approved by evidence, so-called evidence, which means basically large grants that are not systemic, where they've received a lot of money that can so-called prove that they can do it. It pays no attention to what we know in our hearts makes a difference for people.
So the registration of being a licensed family and marital therapist, is it MFT or LFM, whatever it is?
Well, even that's disappearing, because now counseling is replacing that because it's cheaper. So counseling, which didn't used to be approved, now the MFTs didn't have a place because the social workers and psychologists and psychiatrists controlled mental health. So the MFTs went into sort of private practice. And in some places like California, they got the regulations to approve them. But now counseling, which has even less training, has family counseling. They add the name family in a couple of courses, and it's as if you understand systemic thinking, which is, I'm 77 years old and I don't understand it, and I've been working on it for 50 some years.
Well, we're
working every day to try to understand it.
Well, we have very complex texts. People often think that we're a sort of a doing profession, but we expect people to read very complex academic theory from across philosophy and the human and biological sciences in order to try and understand some of what it is we do and why people behave the way they do, why society behaves the way it does. So there's a lot for people to focus on, and it's a shame to hear that the trainings are being dumbed down. If finally,
and I wouldn't say they're even training people to understand complex texts. I don't even think they expect them to read much of anything. There are just no. It's just like off the map. It's like if you took some very watered down course, they don't even care what you read. I'm sorry to say that. And what I'm hoping is, as long as I can do it, to keep on trying to write the same kinds of what I hope are meaningful systemic texts like I ever was trying to do, and which I'm still, I have to rewrite everything every few years because I realize I didn't say it as well as I should have. But I just hope we hold on by our fingernails until we get to a place where people are really paying attention to this. I think it's our only salvation.
Monica, thank you so much for participating in this talk today. It's been really fantastic. I think I've learned a lot. I think others will learn a lot from listening to you.
I'm sorry if it didn't seem hopeful, because I am in my heart very hopeful, and I do plan to keep on trying to think it through and express it as well as I can, and also collaborate with all my friends and get their help to think systemically for as long as I can.
In that sense, you're doing a very important job. We need people to carry the hope and carry the critique. So thank you. And thanks for talking with me today. That's been a real joy.